Okay. By the way, is the sound too loud? Is it too loud? No? It's okay. How many people here are using translators on their head? Okay. Hi, translators. I met them earlier. Is it Valerie and I forgot his name. Anyway, I had an interesting conversation about translation because, you know, I'm from Israel. And half of the population of Israel is actually Russian. So when I went to military, half of my friends there taught me Russian, but they taught me all the bad parts, okay? So counting, like raz, dva, and ping pong and all that stuff, and all the cursing that is related when you lose. So that's all I know. I cannot use it in this talk. I apologize. With that, let's begin. So just before we begin, I had a quick question. How many people here are in the QA department today? Okay, how many people here are in a developer or architect role? Okay, managers? And the rest, I guess, marketing? What do you do? By the way, there's lots of room here right next to me if you want to sit. Yeah, nah, they're afraid. Okay, well, our talk today is going to be something that, you know, I've been wondering about in the past few years. Just a little bit about me, where I come from, my background. I've been working in the software industry for about 20 years. I started out in Visual Basic, if anyone remembers that. Still one of my favorite languages. I don't care what anyone says. But I got to work in many different languages, including C#, C++, Ruby, Java, and Python, and a lot of different things. But there are some things that keep repeating no matter what language you use. For example, the notion of unit testing or test-driven development. I wrote a book about that because people kept asking the same questions. So I said, just take the book. And then when I realized that nobody's doing unit testing, even though I wrote a book about it, I thought, why isn't anyone doing unit testing? And I realized the problem is mostly how do we work with people, leadership-related stuff. How do I, as a leader, get people to change their behavior to start doing the right thing? So I wrote a book about that called Elastic Leadership. Okay, so far so good. But these days, when I do consulting for companies, and I mostly work for big companies, from 500 people to 5,000 to 50,000, some things are still not working, surprisingly, right? Some things are not working in the software industry. Some of these things have to do with the way we work with each other, which is really what the topic of this talk is. So here are some things that I encounter on a daily basis when I consult for developers and for testers and for a lot of different people in different positions. People say stuff like, they don't see what I see. They don't give me enough time to do things the right way. There's no way we can automate all this. Has anyone ever encountered that? We are trying to do the right thing, but everything is high priority, so we can never do everything that we need to do. We are mostly maintaining documentation instead of actually giving real value. So does any of this sound familiar? Raise your hand if it sounds familiar in your job today. Okay. If you have not raised your hand, probably need some coffee at this point. Why is this? Why are these things happening? You know, when I'm a big believer in continuous delivery, and DevOps is just the latest incarnation of that. But when I go to to companies and we're trying to make that stuff work, one of the biggest factors is how does everyone reorganize to work in that type of situation? And that's what really hurts this transformation. So in this talk, I'm going to cover three main topics. I'm going to talk about pipeline-based organizations. I'm going to explain what that is to me and why it affects each and every one here, and also other types of categories of work, not just testing. I'm going to talk about the role of a new role called the test architect and how that can help mitigate some of these things. And I'm going to talk about one technique that test architects can use called test recipes with layer strategies. And I know it's a long name. And I specifically called it test recipes because it's not a test plan. It's not something that you might know. It's specifically trying to be something a bit different. And the hope is that with the realization that things are changing around us and we need to find a way to work in the new way, and with these techniques, we can start making a difference and be more, feel like we're contributing more and not feel like we're being either left behind or that we are moving in one direction and the organization is moving in another direction. Another name for this new like pipeline-based organization is, I like to call it SDLC 2.0. Raise your hand if you know what SDLC means. SDLC, Software Development Lifecycle, okay? And the reason I want to talk about this is because some of the reasons that affect the pain that we have has to do specifically with that, with the way we develop software. So we've all seen these words before, right? Lean and agile, and automated, and pipelines. Pipelines, I'll explain in a second what a pipeline is. But if we imagine the world that existed until 10 years ago and then the world that we're living in right now in software, the world used to work in a very waterfallish way, and in the past 10 years there's been a huge shift towards something different, something that maybe is better, we don't know. In fact, nobody really knows how to develop software yet. Nobody in the world, it's too new. It's only been around for a few dozen years, that's it. So if we don't really know how to develop software the right way, and a lot of projects still fail, this is the current iteration that the industry is trying, okay? The idea of lean and agile and pipeline-based organizations is just another experiment, but it's a huge experiment, and a lot of companies are doing it because they know a different way or something else that they want to try. They've tried other things, now they're trying this. Whether it's the right way, I don't know. It feels like it's better than what we had before, but maybe in 5 or 10 years we'll know if this was a huge disaster as well. Just like waterfall felt really great at some point, and then it didn't fit anymore for a lot of organizations. But either way, whether it's the right thing to do or not, it is the reality that we live in that usually the companies we work in are trying to move in this direction. And in fact, a lot of us might support a lot of these directions, but we have to learn to live with that. So I want to specifically talk about the idea of a pipeline-based organization because it's something that nobody really explains, but it's a huge factor in the way that QA and developers and a lot of different people in the organization change their work. And when we understand how it changes the work, we can start to see what we need to learn and do differently to support it better, and then maybe things will flow better. So a pipeline-based organization, if you've all heard about the stories about Netflix and the Googles and all that stuff, and how they ship software 3 million times a day, etc. But really, when I look at these companies, I look at them and I say, these are pipeline-based companies. And when I say pipeline-based, it means that there is an automated pipeline that makes the decisions, most of the decisions in the company relating to the release of the code, okay? So if we look at the top, we have dev, QA, ops, compliance, security. The decisions are made inside the pipeline, here in the middle. Now, what are these decisions, right? When we say pipeline, we mean maybe imagine a Jenkins job or a TeamCity or something like that, that are running a bunch of scripts, and those scripts return 0 or 1, and a 0 is success and a 1 is failure. And so each task can be green or red, and if one of the tasks is red, the whole pipeline is red and the pipeline has failed. So if you think of a pipeline, it's really a big test. It's either red or green, and each decision is about whether to continue the pipeline. So what are these types of decisions that a pipeline can make that we usually do today manually? Well, developers, they make a lot of decisions manually today. in non-pipeline-based organizations. For example, they approved for someone to merge code into a specific branch. And only then that specific branch will be built and then deployed. What about QA? QA in many organizations that I see, they have the huge task of approving or accepting things, right? Does anyone here have to approve or accept things in their job on a day-to-day basis? What a huge, scary thing, right? If I'm working in a company and the whole release is depending on me accepting something or not accepting it, my legs are going to shake, right? Well, Roy, is it okay that we deliver this feature that can affect thousands of customers with millions of lines, with millions of dollars? Okay, I think it's okay. And so what do? We make sure that we don't screw up. So how do we make sure? We do everything necessary to make sure that when we say something, we can back it up, right? In other words, we want to cover our asses, okay? We want to make sure we don't get fired for approving something. We also care about the quality of the product. We care about a lot of good things, but eventually we also have to feed our children. We also want a salary at the end of the month. So we want to make sure we don't get fired, and when someone puts this kind of burden on us, that's a scary thought. But in a pipeline-based organization, that decision moves away from QA and is living inside a pipeline. So the pipeline, which is basically a job, will probably, just like when they did with developers where it would compile something and run a bunch of unit tests, maybe the pipeline would run a bunch of acceptance tests, which are automated, and if one of them fails, it will say, not good to go. Now, can we trust the pipeline to do that? We have to build a pipeline that we can trust so that we can give it this responsibility. But in a pipeline-based organization, if a pipeline is red, we do not deploy. If a pipeline is green, we can deploy, and maybe we already did. We just didn't turn on the feature. So the decision is no longer at a person. What a huge relief for me as someone who had to accept something when I say, it's not me, it's the pipeline said it was red, and that's good. Or the pipeline said it was green. Now, making good pipelines is a skill, and we'll talk about those skills, but that's part of the thing we want to learn. Security. Security people have traditionally been very, very far away from development and testing. They live in their own little, tower. Usually there's 1 or 2 people for 1,000 people in the organization. They have these rules, and you have to ask them permission. It's like going to Gandalf and asking for permission for opening a firewall or whatever. Security also changes in a pipeline-based organization because the pipeline can make a decision about security by running security tests that we design. Now, what if I want to introduce a new feature relating to security? I can design it in the application's infrastructure to open a specific port, and the specific test will tell me whether that port creates an issue in an automated way. And there are toolings and tests for that kind of stuff. So security can also be incorporated into a pipeline. So instead of a human making a decision in 2 weeks, we can have a pipeline automatically making at least a verification that you didn't break anything bad. Operations. Now operations, someone took a bunch of IT people that were in charge of infrastructure and maybe integration and said, you are now called DevOps. Okay, what does DevOps actually mean? Well, in a pipeline-based organization, it means that any decisions that operations people used to make manually, we want to push to move into a pipeline. So what type of decision? Whether an environment can be built or not, to load an environment, yes or no, to deploy to an environment, versioning, configuration, deploying to production, rolling back production. All of these things today are, in many companies, handled by people that have to make manual decisions to actually start the process. But in a pipeline-based organization, the pipeline can make a lot of these decisions for us. So that's what I mean when I say in a pipeline-based organization, our roles have to change. And maybe you've started feeling some of it already at your jobs. Maybe in your jobs you've heard things like, well, so what do we need all this for when we have this? Which is absolutely true. If this is making a lot of the decisions, what are we supposed to do? If our job used to be making decisions. And this is the dilemma that we all live in. And the dilemma is not just in the QA world and in the testing world. It's in all of these worlds. Compliance, operations, security, and development as well. So let's talk about what that means. New skills have to be developed. Now, I'm specifically not, I'm going to talk about QA last because I want you to understand just how much pain a lot of companies are going through right now. And it's not just testing and QA that feels that pain. Everyone around you is going to feel that pain. So here's what I hear from developers when we move into more continuous delivery and pipeline-based organizations. Developers now have to learn new things. If I'm a developer, I used to just work on a front end or the back end. Suddenly, I have to work in a feature team. In a feature team, I now have to coach people and I have to learn from people to work on things that didn't used to be my job. So now I have to learn these new things, even though it wasn't in my original job description. I have to learn about automated testing. Maybe I don't like, maybe that was always not my job. Maybe it was your job. Maybe it was someone else's job. Maybe there's a team somewhere in Croatia that is writing all the automated tests. I'm a developer, why am I supposed to do this? But suddenly, someone like Roy is coming in and saying, no, you have to write automated tests as well. Why? Why do you want me to write the automated tests? And remember that the reason is because we want to make sure that the pipeline makes the decision instead of a person. So when we write tests for a pipeline, we're basically teaching the pipeline how to make a decision. So that the pipeline can make it faster and commonly and multiple times a day for us. And suddenly we come to developers and we say, no, you also have to learn infrastructure and automation and all the Jenkins jobs and how that stuff works. And I see developers all the time going, what the hell, why do you want me to learn all that stuff? That's the DevOps people's job. Operations people. But in a pipeline world, a lot of that infrastructure and the way that the pipeline works has to be taught by all the different disciplinaries. So if I'm a developer and I want to be able to teach the pipeline to run a specific set of tests, I need to be able to change the pipeline. I have to live with it. I have to kind of train it. So I have to understand how it works. And security has become a big part of development as well. Have you heard of DevSecOps? That's basically it. It's bringing security into the pipeline as well. So suddenly developers also have to develop a mindset for security, which I will admit almost no developers are really good at. So if I'm a developer and I have this huge list of tasks, and I also have to add coaching to that because I work in a feature team, my life has just become challenging. Okay, next up, operations people. They're going to have fun in a pipeline-based world, I can tell you. Because operations people, which are basically IT people that someone put like a stamp on their forehead and said, DevOps. They're now, what am I supposed to do? Well, you have to create infrastructure as code. What? No, I just load up an environment, I create a virtual machine, and I do everything manually. No. You have to have a pipeline that does the environment for you. And of course, because it's code, you have to learn how to code that type of stuff with all those scripts and all those frameworks. And we have to have, of course, automated infrastructure testing, right? And we have to, of course, integrate it into a pipeline. And I want you to also do coaching to developers about how to work with the pipeline. And you can see when I talk to operations people how they become pale in the face when you explain all these things, right? Their world is changing upside down. Their job is completely different. Well, maybe in 5 years, but this is the direction. Security people. Security people in a pipeline world. They also have to learn about automated security tests, which they might already have, they just don't run it inside a pipeline. They have to they have to learn how to coach other people and teach them how to write more secure code. They have to learn how to integrate their thoughts and their tests into a Jenkins pipeline, for example. So security also has a huge challenge because security, again, traditionally, not really talking to anyone. They usually don't even report to the IT managers. They report usually directly to the CTO or the CEO because they're security. So suddenly they have to make this huge culture shift. And QA. So what does QA have to learn in a pipeline-based world? Well, can you actually see? Maybe you can see it on the TV. Let's see, maybe we can make it bigger, like this. Okay, oh, that's actually worse. Automated testing and coding. So raise your hand if you know how to code in some language. Okay, perfect. But if I asked in an enterprise organization, if I put all of the testers and QA in that organization in a room and I asked the same question, it probably would be less than half, sometimes even 10%. There's a huge shift in the industry and a lot of people don't have those skills yet, so they have to learn. Automated testing and coding becomes part of the job. What about test infrastructure? That usually is not part of the job. Even if you're writing automated tests, that's usually a job for a different team. But understanding the test infrastructure allows us to write tests that are faster, better, with better feedback loops, and I'll explain in a few slides. And of course, learning how to integrate our tests into a pipeline and working with the pipeline and changing it. And of course, coaching. Where is the coaching coming from? Well, everyone has to learn how to write tests, not just QA. So if we have all of these different categories of people, now they all have to learn these new skills just so they can satisfy a pipeline in the middle. And to me, that's where the shift is going right now. This is what I see. This is, I think, where we're trying to end up. I kind of like a lot of these directions. I think that they can help in many ways. But whether it's the right thing or not, it doesn't matter, because that is the direction that we all have to exist in. And so we have to learn how to deal with that. Now, you might look at all these things and you're saying, you know, I have to learn from security, right? I put colors so I can see who's coaching who. You know, ops have to teach us, ops have to teach all of these people, devs have to teach all of these people how to write code, QA has to teach all of these people how to write tests. So everyone is kind of like spaghetti using collaboration with all these people just so we can make a pipeline work. So what the hell? Why should we even do it? I mean, how much work is it? How much of a change is it to actually make this work? I mean, if we look at the learning that's involved here, that's not easy. That's really, really difficult. And remember, the organizations that you're working in, and a lot of times the organizations I work in, they are going through these changes. So it's important to realize that the pain that you might be feeling, you're not the only ones. You just don't really talk about it too much. So what's in it for you to learn to live in a pipeline-based world? Well, the beautiful thing about pipelines, as I said before, they're actually a big test. And in a pipeline, almost everything is a test, which means that the skill of testing, of looking at software in specific ways, of understanding something at the meta level, which a lot of times QA people have had a much better understanding than development on how an application is supposed to behave, on the needs of the customer, a lot of these things, that skill is going to be needed more and more in a pipeline-based organization, because everyone is going to have to teach the pipeline how to make a decision. And to make a decision, we have to have an informed decision with a good test, with good scenarios, to understand what should we test and what we shouldn't test. For example, these are two examples of pipelines. The first one That's called a delivery pipeline, and the bottom one is a discovery pipeline. The difference is that the delivery pipeline that might do a build and run a bunch of tests, it actually ends up with a deploy. A discovery pipeline ends up with a bunch of KPIs. These are two types of pipeline that exist in organizations. They don't call them that, but they exist. There's two different types. Now, where are the tests in these pipelines? All over. All of these areas would need coaching and training and learning on how to write them. Performance testing, load testing, security testing, even unit testing. Because a lot of developers don't really think about the scenarios the way that you would think about the scenarios. So that type of coaching is very, very important. Okay, so with that, that's the reality. That's the potential. That's where we can go. But how do we go there? Well, not in one night, right? Not in one day. It has to be an incremental way of working. And in organizations where I usually work, I'm going to drop the whole thing in a second. In organizations where I usually work, there is no, okay, everybody gather around, we're all going to work in a new way tomorrow. No, there are incremental steps that we can take, and I'm going to recommend a couple of them. The first is to introduce the concept of a test architect. Now, the cynical part might say, that's just changing the name of a person, just like you changed IT to DevOps. But a test architect's role is different than what a QA is traditionally doing. So imagine a test architect, just like a standard architect, which is a person that's main job is to coach people, teach people, and help think about the big picture. But it also includes coding and automating things as an incremental step. Eventually, if you think about it, since everyone is going to learn how to code security and ops and all of those people, eventually everyone becomes a type of developer. Eventually. Everyone is coding stuff, everyone is writing tests. That's basically development. So everyone becomes a type of developer, but right now as an intermediary step, everyone has to learn how to test those things that they're writing. So coaching becomes a big part, and being part of the planning meetings, working on test recipes, which I will explain very, very shortly, and actually doing development. That is being in the room and being part of a development team. It is no longer, as a test architect, it is no longer needed to be in a separate organization or group. It is being part of a development team and actually working with developers on a day-to-day basis. So I'm not going to talk about all the other roles. I'm just going to talk about test architects and developers. They both have to learn all of these different things together, and they both have to do coaching with each other. And this is where we see a lot of the disconnect between developers and QA, because usually they are physically disconnected. Usually they don't really talk to each other except in specific points of time. So one of the techniques I want to show here is called a test recipe. So it's a good way to connect all of these things. I'm going to show that in a Zoom in a couple of seconds. But the reason for the test recipe, the main reason for it, is to get people to work together. Okay? It also has a lot of other benefits, and it might feel familiar, but it's different. And I've already tried it in a few companies that I was consulting for, and it has made big differences. It's not, it's not a silver bullet, but it makes things better. So this is an example of a test recipe. Now, you can write it on a piece of paper, or you can write it inside Jira, right next to the description of the feature. So what you see here is basically a line per scenario. Now, a line per scenario, for a scenario that we think about, and for each line at the left, we see which level we want to test that scenario. Now, it's important to realize that the test recipe is written together when a feature is starting. If an iteration has begun, before starting to work on a feature, developer and test architect sit together for 5, 10, 15 minutes, and they create a test recipe for the feature just before development begins. Okay? Not before the iteration, but after the iteration. You can have variations on it. Maybe you can try to do it before. But for me, it seems to be working the best during the development phase itself, inside an iteration. So before development starts, imagine that we're just sitting together at the desk of either the test architect or the developer, and we're working out what type of scenarios should we be testing that feature. And the question should be, what types of things should we test that we feel confident that that stuff is working okay? So we start here. We write down a bunch of scenarios, we decide which levels we want to test them at, and then we split up and we work in parallel, where developers and test architects work and actually code things on their own. You can even pair together if you want, but I think that's a more incremental way. Now, usually developers in this incremental phase will take the lower level unit test and component test, and test architects will take high level tests and infrastructure, but they code them together in parallel. And every once in a while, they would sync. They would sync here because there's a question, or you know what, I came up with a few different scenarios. But the idea is that they're both developing software, because tests are part of the software. The tests are part of the pipeline. And the done is basically all the tests are passing for that feature. That's it. Now, it's a single task. It's not one task for test architect and one task for developer to write all these things. It's a single task that two people are working on. And those two people are then planning the list of scenarios that they would like to test, that they feel confident in, and they decide which layers those things are coming in, and then they go and they start working in parallel. Now, what usually happens is that the test architect has less work than the developer, because they usually don't write the actual production code, and usually because higher level tests, there will be less of them than lower level tests. But because there is more free time, the time is being used by the test architect to learn new skills, for example, automation, infrastructure, pipelines. There is a lot of learning that has to be done. This is that time where you learn, because you're going to do things in a slower fashion. So when I look at this, and it's just a list. It's just, think of it like comments in source code. It is not a test plan, but you might look at this and say, what the hell? That's a test plan, Roy. That's just a list of tests. We have tools for that. We have processes for that. That's just another fancy word for, no, it's absolutely different. It's different because we do not go into the details of each test and each scenario and all the steps in it. It is just higher level of how things should be working. It is a concerted effort of two people working together, combining their knowledge into a single output. So one of the biggest things that it is not two separate work items. So when I was introducing this concept to a couple of QA people, one of them said, okay, so I understand. So I will prepare my thoughts on what goes in to the test recipe. The developer will work and they will prepare their thoughts, and then we meet together and then we create the joint test recipe. No, that's exactly what I don't want to happen. Because when you do that, nobody's actually learning from each other. And the point of this is to learn from each other and to do the coaching and to learn to collaborate with each other. For example, I will just come in and we'll do the test recipe together. We will brainstorm. It is a brainstorming meeting that outputs in a bunch of different cases and scenarios. There are many things that can go right when you do test recipes. Here are the things that I noticed. It's going to, maybe I'll zoom in. Let's see if that works. Okay, shortening the test cycle. I'm going to talk about that in a second, but one of the things that you end up with because of a test recipe is that the tests are actually much faster. Doesn't seem right. Maybe it doesn't seem like it has anything to do with it, but I'll explain in the next slides. The next thing, it actually makes us think before we act. Where are you? Where are you? There you are. Think before we act. A lot of times developers, they like to just jump into development. And the test recipe is a way for us to coach them on what it is that we're actually trying to develop. What does it mean success when we finish developing it? What are the key factors that we care about? How do you think about testing that they don't? How do they think about development that you don't? So you learn a lot of different things from each other. Next thing that it creates, caring. Because one of the things that I see a lot is that developers care about the test that they wrote, and QA care about the tests that they wrote. So during the day, developers will commit code and maybe run unit tests, and then at night, the important build happens. But the developers don't look at the important build because it's almost always red because the tests are the configuration is so difficult. So we always have 2 or 3 tests that are failing for some reason. And so if developers look at that, they have no idea whether it's passing or not. So we need special translators. I call them build whisperers, okay? So in a lot of organizations, in the QA department, there is a person, the developers, whose role is to look at the build and say, no, it's okay. And that person then comes in and tells everyone whether the build is actually okay or not. The build seems always red, but sometimes it's actually green. That's what I mean by translators. And here's the thing. It's a separate build. It runs in different times, and different types of people are looking at it. But really, to deliver software, you need both of the fast builds and the slow ones. And you want all of the people from both sides to look at both of these things. So by creating a test recipe, as a developer, I start seeing the other side of the wall. Oh, so those are the types of end-to-end tests you might be thinking of doing. And you might be seeing the other side of the wall as well. Oh, these are the unit tests you were thinking of doing. Because a lot of times there's also duplication. So one of the things that we want to do is to have a way to find the duplication. And when we do the test recipe, we realize that we're thinking about multiple scenarios in multiple levels, and we just make sure that we only have a scenario in one of them. I'll explain in a second. Finding missing testability shortcuts. This is great. This is one of the things that has saved so much time that I've seen people do. Because you're sitting together and you're saying, well, I think that should be an end-to-end test. Oh, but it's going to take so long. And the developer might say, oh no, but you know, I can just give you a shortcut URL or a special ID that you don't have to jump all through all these hoops, and then you can actually run the test much faster. Or you can sit down and say to the developer, you know what? XPath sucks. Please give me IDs for all the things that you want me to test in Selenium. But at least you're talking, you can talk about that stuff. And those things are really, really important because that time saves both the runtime of the tests and also the frustration that we might feel when we're trying to write tests. You might realize that something that you've been doing the hard way has an easy way to do it, but because we've never talked to developers about that specific scenario, you don't even know about it. Coaching, we talked about that. Avoiding unnecessary side documentation. Instead of spending time writing an hour of a test plan with all the steps, we just have the scenarios. Where are all the steps documented? In the tests. The tests themselves are code. They are self-documenting. And so if I want to know what a test is doing, I can look at the test. I don't have to look at a test plan. I can just look at the scenario high level. And if I want to understand what a test is doing, the name of the test is important, the way the test is written is important, but it is self-documenting. And we're working as a team, not in silos. We actually share information with each other. I want to talk about the feedback loop. We actually usually start this. There is a first phase where we just say, okay, these are all the scenarios I can think about. We don't even talk about whether it's a unit test or something else. We just decide, you know what, that makes sense, and I think we should test this. And what about if we do this? You know, this is, in this case, this is a video authorization. Or you know what if we test that with the streaming service, we have good credentials, it should work. But if we had bad credentials, we should get a message. And if we have a user over quota, then we fail with the specific message. And if the token refresh is needed, then we do a refresh and then retry. If a session restarts within a time threshold, we have to do a reauthorization. Over the time threshold, log in again, et cetera, et cetera. So we just brainstorm about all these things. And the brainstorming part is great because a developer will come up with a bunch of things and you'll come up with a bunch of things and they usually don't match exactly. So you learn from each other about how the other person thinks, which is really the way coaching should work. If I want to be a good coach, the way that I measure my success is if someone doesn't need me, right? If they can think the way I do in a specific situation, they don't need me in that situation. So good coaching, if I'm a tester and I want to do coaching and I become a test architect, then my job is to create other test architects, make people think the way I think. That's a good success rate. Will they actually not need me? Not true. Because my value will grow to the organization because I can actually grow the skills of people around me. So I'm actually much more useful to the organization. So after this first phase, we have the scenarios. Now we have to decide at which level we test them. So this is a fairly standard chart of the different types of tests. I'm going to go over it very, very quickly. At the bottom, we have unit tests. They run really, really fast. We have component tests that are basically a bunch of components together, but still in memory. We have integration tests. So integration tests, we actually might be using network or databases or stuff like that. We have API tests. So we have to use the API level of something if it's a service. Then we have end-to-end isolated and end-to-end system. The end-to-end isolated basically means that I run a full system test, usually through something close to the UI, if not the user interface itself. But I don't use actual third party. So I don't use really Google authentication or anything like that. I use simulators for that type of stuff. And then we have system tests where I don't fake anything. I just use the real things everywhere. And of course, the best confidence is at the top. We agree on that, right? Because the top is the closest to production that we will ever have if the environment is good. But it's slow, very, very slow, and it's hard to maintain, and it's hard to write, and it's hard to debug, but it's the best confidence. And at the bottom, we have really, really fast feedback loops, but there are some things that you just cannot test, so you will never have the best confidence. So we have to have a combination. But usually, if I can choose where to write a test, a lot of times organizations will go this route, somewhere at the top. Well, if I have to test something, I might as well test it with the highest confidence level. Totally makes sense. But then you end up with 5 hours, 12 hours of runtime for tests that, of course, are almost always failing at for some obscure reason, not because there is a bug. And then we start getting, you know, build whisperers and translators and all that stuff. So we want fast feedback loop. Sometimes we go this route. In many companies, you'll see, oh, we just have unit tests and component tests, and that's good enough for us. But if you look at this, you might feel, what the hell, that's crazy. You don't even have a couple of end-to-end tests or something to gain confidence, because you don't know, these all work separately, but the glue that holds them together is missing. We don't test it. So in a lot of companies, we have this. Okay, different silos. We work on these, we work on these, we care about that, and we care about that. That's nightly build, continuous integration build. But to deliver, we need both of them, right? We want the feedback loop to be fast, but we want the confidence to be high. This is where the strategy of what to choose comes in. So what I like to do, what I like to teach people is to pick and choose, create a recipe. So for a feature, feature X, I will usually prefer to test at the lowest level unless I cannot. So I'll go one level up. If there's something I cannot test at this level, I'll go one level up. If I test something at one level, I will not test it at a lower level. I don't need to, because it's usually covered from a higher level. So for example, if I'm trying to do authentication, there is no question that I would want at least a couple of end-to-end tests for that feature. In fact, the first end-to-end test for that type of feature will bring the most ROI, the most return on investment, right? Because it will bring the most coverage that we didn't have before, and much more confidence because it checks that everything works all the way to the database and back again. There's a flow that happens. But if we write another one right here, the return on investment is much lower, because usually what it does, it just duplicates the first one and then does a small variation. So the coverage is is almost not different. The variation is, but the value is much smaller compared to everything else. We still have to pay for the second test maintenance cost and runtime and debugging, right? But we get very little value for it. So if I have one variation at the high level, I'll do the other variations at lower levels, maybe just unit test, maybe API level, and these levels give me a much faster feedback loop and the ability to create scenarios in a much more easy way. If they fail, it's much easier to understand why. But I also have the confidence that overall, the glue that holds everything together is working. So then the thinking becomes, look, if this one is passing, it's like a laundry line, you know, where you put the laundry on. I know that there is a line between X and Y, and that line seems to be okay. But all the small variations, I'll test them within this. So then I can say, if these are passing and that is passing, I'm okay. That's good enough. And that's what I mean by high confidence, faster feedback loop. So when we go back to the test recipe, that's the discussion we have. After we write down all the scenarios, we say, okay, so which level should we test? So maybe you as a QA, I still say it in my head, right? As a QA head, but you're a test architect now. You're saying, you know what? We definitely need at least an end-to-end here because I will not feel confident in doing this. But I don't think we need to do this as an end-to-end. That could be an API level. And what do you think? What about unit testing for the rest of the stuff? Can you do that? And the developer might say, oh, that's so easy to write a unit test. Hey, even for this, you might go together and look if there is an existing end-to-end test that already covers most of that scenario. A lot of times when we write new features, it's on addition to existing features. So you might already have an end-to-end test in place that covers most of it, so you don't have to check all the glue. You just have to check the lower levels of variations. What if this is true? What if this is false? What if this is over the threshold? All that good stuff. So you might end up with a separation where you have very little high-level stuff and much more lower level, which is the test pyramid, right? So my rule of thumb is usually it's 1 to 5, 1 to 10, right? I usually try to go lower level, and unless there's no other way and I wouldn't feel good about it, I go up one level. Make sense? So we get a faster feedback loop with high enough confidence. There is never enough confidence until you actually run it in production. And even then there is not enough confidence. And we have less waste because all this stuff took 5, 10, 15 minutes. It's really because it's very high level, we don't have to then go and document it in a separate system and do all this kind of maintenance for text. Because we go in and we actually start writing the infrastructure and the test that we need to actually make that work. So we go directly into creating value into the pipeline. So just to summarize, the pipeline-based organizations, they are the current reality that we're moving towards. Whether we like it or not, we have to learn to live with them. And in that reality, we have to learn how to get other people that have to write tests for the pipeline to learn from us. So coaching becomes a big part. We also have to learn how to live with those new pipelines. which means that techniques like the test recipe is a good way for us to have an excuse to say, you know, I know we usually don't talk with each other that much, but we have to create a test recipe together. So let's just work on it, 5-10 minutes. We'll meet once a day just to see how things are working out. Then we'll separate, but it all has to pass. So we all have to look at the same pipeline to see how everything is working. Resources. So if you want to learn more about that type of stuff, there's a blog that I'm writing at enterprisedevops.org. There's a blog about leadership and how to change things and behaviors around you at 5whys.com. There's a nice book called Agile Testing, if you haven't read it. It's not specifically about this, but it's an alternative view of working in this type of new organization. It's a variation of some of the things that I said, but it doesn't mention the idea of test recipe. I kind of like that idea, so I kind of removed a lot of the ideas that they have, but it's important. A lot of stuff that I didn't talk about exists in this book, and it's really good. I wrote a book called Elastic Leadership, which is all about if you're an expert in an organization about something, what do you do about that knowledge? How do you actually make yourself more valuable? And if you want to contact me, if you have questions, you can either tweet me at Roy Osherove or send an email, and I'm happy to answer questions after the keynote. So with that, just before we finish, in this conference, you're going to learn a lot of different techniques about automation and all that stuff. Remember that the big challenge is about getting that stuff into a pipeline and getting everyone else to look at it. Good luck. May the force be with you. Thank you.